At 1:54 a.m., a 19-year-old college student called his parents and asked for help. He was calm. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't panicking. He simply said his car was stuck and he couldn't find his way home. For the next 47 minutes, his parents stayed on the phone with him. They listened as he walked through the darkness of rural Minnesota, describing gravel roads, distant lights, and the sound of water nearby. They drove through the night, desperately trying to reach him before his phone battery died. And then, without warning, he said 2 words, "Oh, shit." The line went silent. That moment, those 2 words are the last confirmed evidence that Brandon Swanson was alive. When police later found his car, it wasn't where Brandon believed it was. When search teams combed the area, they found no footprints, no clothing, no phone, no remains, no trace of where Brandon went after that final call. More than 15 years later, his disappearance remains officially unsolved. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just that Brandon vanished. It's that he disappeared while help was actively searching for him, while his parents were listening in real time, while his voice was guiding them closer, and then suddenly stopped. No witnesses saw him leave the road. No surveillance cameras captured his movements. No physical evidence explains where he went or what happened next. Only a dark stretch of farmland, a silent river nearby, and a phone call that ended too abruptly. Tonight, we're not here to speculate, we're not here to accuse, and we're not here to invent answers that don't exist. This documentary follows the verified timeline of Brandon Swanson's final night, minute by minute, using confirmed records, police reports, and family statements. Because sometimes the most disturbing mysteries aren't hidden in distant places. They happen while someone is still on the line. Before he became a missing person, before his name appeared on flyers and police reports, Brandon Swanson was a 19-year-old college student living an ordinary life, one defined more by routine than risk. Brandon was born and raised in Minnesota, surrounded by open farmland, quiet towns, and long, empty roads that most locals navigated without a second thought. He grew up in a close-knit family where communication was constant and expectations were clear. His parents described him as responsible, polite, and steady. Someone who checked in, followed plans, and rarely caused concern. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't secretive, and he wasn't known for taking unnecessary chances. By 2008, Brandon was attending Minnesota West Community and Technical College, where he studied wind energy technology. It was a practical choice, rooted in opportunity rather than ambition. Wind farms were expanding across the Midwest, and Brandon saw a future that was stable, hands-on, and close to home. Friends described him as quiet but social. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he wasn't withdrawn either. He liked spending time with people he trusted, preferred familiar environments, and rarely strayed far outside his comfort zone. He enjoyed video games, hanging out with friends, and the simple independence that came with being away at college, while still deeply connected to his family. That connection mattered. Brandon spoke to his parents frequently, not out of obligation, but habit. Calls were casual, unforced, updates about classes, plans for the weekend, small details that didn't feel important until they were gone. His parents knew his routines. They knew where he usually went, who he spent time with, and when to expect him home. That's why the night he disappeared didn't begin with alarm. It began like dozens of others before it. On the evening of May 13, 2008, Brandon attended a small gathering near Canby, Minnesota. It wasn't a wild party. It wasn't spontaneous. It was a graduation celebration, something predictable, something planned. People there later recalled nothing unusual about his behavior. He wasn't upset. He wasn't arguing with anyone. He wasn't acting impaired. Most importantly, he had a plan. Brandon intended to drive home afterward. It was a drive he had made before, along roads he believed he knew. Rural Minnesota highways can stretch for miles with little variation. Gravel roads intersecting with paved ones, farm fields breaking the darkness, landmarks that only make sense if you've grown up around them. To Brandon, this wasn't unfamiliar territory. It was home. He left the gathering late, but not unusually so. There was no sense of urgency, no emotional weight attached to the decision to drive, nothing that suggested this night would be different from any other. That detail matters, because when investigators later reviewed the case, they found no evidence that Brandon was trying to escape something, meet someone, or change his routine. There were no secret plans, no unexplained behavior in the days leading up to that night. His bank accounts were untouched. His phone showed no suspicious messages. His personal life was, by all available accounts, stable. In missing person cases, investigators often look for disruption, financial trouble, emotional stress, relationship conflicts, signs of withdrawal. In Brandon's case, those indicators were absent. He was where he was supposed to be, doing what he was supposed to be doing, following a plan that had worked before. Even his parents would later say that if Brandon ever found himself in trouble, lost, stuck, or uncertain, he would call them, not as a last resort, but as a first instinct. And that instinct is the most important part of this story. Because when Brandon realized something had gone wrong later that night, he didn't panic. He didn't disappear intentionally. He did exactly what he had always done. He called home. At the time, his parents had no reason to fear the call. A stuck car was inconvenient, not terrifying. Rural roads swallowed vehicles all the time. Ditches were common, especially at night. Brandon sounded calm. He didn't describe injuries. He didn't say he was in danger. He believed help was close, and so did they. This is what makes Brandon Swanson's disappearance so deeply unsettling. There was no dramatic break from routine, no obvious warning sign, no moment where anyone could say, "This is where everything changed." The night was supposed to end the same way so many others had. A drive home. A phone call saying he'd made it. Another ordinary day waiting on the other side. Instead, it became the last time anyone heard his voice. And understanding who Brandon was before that moment, his habits, his family ties, his predictable choices, is essential, because it removes the comfort of believing that only reckless decisions lead to tragedy. Sometimes people don't vanish because they made a wrong choice. Sometimes they disappear because an ordinary night stopped being ordinary, without warning, without witnesses, and without leaving a trace behind. The gathering Brandon attended that night wasn't hidden, secretive, or spontaneous. It was a graduation party held near Canby, a small town surrounded by farmland and long stretches of rural roads. Events like this were common. Friends celebrating milestones, people coming and going in small groups, conversations spilling late into the night. Nothing about the party stood out. Witnesses later told investigators that Brandon Swanson arrived without incident and behaved normally throughout the evening. He socialized, talked with friends, and showed no signs of distress. There were no arguments, no emotional confrontations, no indication that he felt unsafe or unsettled. This matters because in many disappearance cases, the final social gathering becomes the focal point, where investigators search for conflict, intoxication, or someone who might have followed the person afterward. In Brandon's case, there was nothing to isolate. The party itself was not large or chaotic. It was the kind of event that slowly thinned as the night went on. People leaving in ones and twos, others staying to help clean up. By the time Brandon decided to head home, the atmosphere was calm. According to those present, his decision to leave didn't raise concern. It wasn't abrupt, it wasn't emotional, it was routine. The timeline begins to narrow around midnight. Brandon planned to drive back to his parents' home in Marshall, Minnesota, a drive of roughly 30 minutes under normal conditions. He had made similar trips before. The route involved a mix of paved highways and gravel roads, depending on the turnoffs chosen. Crucially, Brandon left the party alone. No one followed him. No one rode with him. No one reported seeing another vehicle trail behind his car as he pulled away. This wasn't unusual. In rural areas, solo drives late at night are common, especially among locals familiar with the roads. At the time, no one considered this a risk. Environmental conditions that night were quiet and unremarkable. There was no severe weather, no heavy rain, snow, or fog. Visibility was normal for a rural night, dark but not obscured. Roads were dry, traffic was minimal. However, rural Minnesota at night carries its own hazards. Gravel roads can look deceptively similar. Intersections may be unmarked or poorly lit. Cell phone coverage can fluctuate without warning. A wrong turn doesn't always announce itself immediately, especially when landmarks are sparse and distances feel shorter than they are. Investigators later noted that even experienced drivers can become disoriented in this environment, particularly after midnight, when fatigue sets in and visual cues blur together. Still, Brandon did not express concern before leaving. There is no evidence that he hesitated, asked for directions, or questioned his route. His phone records show no outgoing calls or messages seeking clarification before he departed. To him, this was a familiar drive, one he expected to complete without incident. This decision, to drive rather than stay overnight or ask for a ride, has been scrutinized endlessly since his disappearance. But it's important to understand it in context. At 19, Brandon was not defying advice or ignoring warnings. He wasn't pushing boundaries. He was making a choice he and many others in his position had made before. Drive home, sleep in his own bed, start the next day as planned. When Brandon pulled away from the party, nothing about his behavior suggested that this night would end differently from dozens of others. The people he left behind didn't watch him go with concern. They didn't remember his departure as significant. In hindsight, that ordinariness is what makes this moment so unsettling. Because once Brandon left, there are no verified sightings of him interacting with anyone else. No witnesses saw him stop along the road. No cameras captured his vehicle passing through intersections. The timeline becomes quiet, empty in a way that only becomes meaningful later. The last known certainty is simple and chilling in its simplicity. Brandon got into his car. He drove away alone, and at some point, the road he believed he was on stopped matching reality. What happened next didn't unfold in a crowded place or under watchful eyes. It happened in darkness, on roads where a single wrong turn can stretch miles before anyone realizes they're lost. And it all began with a decision that at the time felt completely safe. By the time Brandon Swanson realized something was wrong, the mistake had already been made. In his mind, Brandon was driving toward Marshall, the town where his parents lived and where he expected to end the night. The route felt familiar. He believed he was following a combination of state highways and local roads he had traveled before, either alone or with friends. That belief shaped every decision that followed. What Brandon did not know, what no one knew at the time, was that he had already left the route he thought he was on. Sometime after leaving the party near Canby, Brandon took a wrong turn. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sharp swerve, no sudden realization. Rural intersections often lack signage, and gravel roads can feel interchangeable in the dark. One unmarked turn can place a driver on a completely different path without immediate consequence. For several minutes, possibly longer, the road still felt right. This is where geography becomes critical. Brandon believed he was near Lind, a small town west of Marshall. That assumption came from visual cues, the direction of travel, the spacing of roads, and the expectation that he was following a known route. When he later called his parents, he told them he could see lights in the distance and believed he was close to Lind. That detail would later prove to be tragically inaccurate. Investigators eventually determined that Brandon was not near Lind at all. Based on phone records, vehicle location, and physical evidence, He was actually several miles north, deep within Yellow Medicine County. The landscape there is flatter, more remote, and far less populated than the areas Brandon thought he was approaching. From the ground, especially at night, the difference is nearly invisible. Farm lights can appear closer than they are. A cluster of distant buildings can suggest a town that's still miles away. Without clear signage or GPS guidance, distance becomes deceptive. A driver may feel close to safety while unknowingly moving farther from it. This is how the confusion began, not with panic, but with confidence. Brandon continued driving under the assumption that he was nearly home. When his car eventually slid into a ditch, the event itself didn't feel catastrophic. The vehicle was damaged but not destroyed. He wasn't injured, he wasn't trapped, and most importantly, he believed he knew where he was. When he called his parents, the conversation reflected that belief. He didn't describe being lost in the wilderness. He described being stuck near a town. He gave directions based on his assumed location, and his parents responded accordingly. Driving toward Lind, scanning roads where they believed Brandon would be waiting, but geography doesn't care what someone believes. As Brandon walked away from his car later that night, every step was guided by a mental map that no longer matched reality. He believed he was moving closer to a paved road, closer to town, closer to help. In truth, he was navigating an area defined by open fields, drainage ditches, fences, and waterways, features that become difficult to identify in darkness and nearly impossible to interpret without landmarks. This mismatch between belief and location created a dangerous feedback loop. Each time Brandon saw lights, he assumed progress. Each time he heard water, he believed he was near a bridge or culvert. Each step reinforced the idea that he was almost there. Meanwhile, his parents were searching an entirely different area. Later, when police analyzed phone tower data and located Brandon's car, the scale of the confusion became clear. The distance between where Brandon thought he was and where he actually was wasn't measured in a few wrong turns. It was measured in miles. Miles of farmland, miles of uneven terrain, miles without witnesses. The wrong turn itself was never precisely identified. Investigators could not determine the exact intersection where Brandon left his intended route. What they could confirm was that once it happened, the consequences quietly compounded. No alarms went off, no immediate danger announced itself, just a growing gap between perception and reality. And in rural darkness, that gap can swallow someone completely. This is the moment when Brandon's situation shifted from inconvenient to precarious, not because of recklessness or fear, but because geography stopped aligning with expectation. By the time he stepped out of his car, he wasn't just trying to get home. He was trying to correct a mistake he didn't know he had made. The moment Brandon Swanson's car left the road was not violent in the way crashes are often imagined. There was no high-speed impact, no rollover, no catastrophic damage. Sometime in the early hours of May 14, 2008, Brandon Swanson drove onto a gravel road that curved gently through farmland. Alongside that road ran a shallow ditch, common in rural Minnesota, designed to manage runoff rather than stop vehicles. Brandon's car slid into it. Investigators later determined that the vehicle came to rest at an angle, its wheels partially embedded in soft ground. The car was disabled but intact. Doors opened normally. Windows were unbroken. There was no evidence of a collision with another vehicle, animal, or structure. Most importantly, there were no signs that Brandon had been injured in the incident. When police examined the scene days later, they found no blood, no torn clothing, and no indication of a struggle inside or around the vehicle. The interior was undisturbed. Personal items remained where they would be expected. This was not the aftermath of a violent crash. It was a mistake. Frustrating, inconvenient, but survivable. That assessment aligns with Brandon's own behavior immediately afterward. When he called his parents, he did not describe pain or panic. He told them his car was stuck. He believed a tow truck could reach him. He believed he could walk to nearby lights if necessary, and he believed firmly that he was close to Lind. This belief shaped everything that followed. From Brandon's perspective, the scene made sense. The road he was on felt like one he had traveled before. He could see distant illumination that he interpreted as town lights. He believed he was within walking distance of help. What Brandon did not realize was that the lights he saw were not Lind. They were isolated farm buildings, scattered miles apart across open land. In daylight, the difference is obvious. At night, it can be impossible to tell. Police later confirmed that Brandon's car was located several miles north of where he believed himself to be, in a remote section of Yellow Medicine County. The area contained no sidewalks, no streetlights, and no direct route to Lind on foot, but Brandon didn't know that. When he spoke to his parents, he described landmarks that seemed logical within his assumed location. He told them he could see lights. He believed he was walking toward a paved road. His parents, trusting his assessment, drove toward Lind, scanning roads and intersections where they expected to find him. They were searching the wrong place. Later, when law enforcement reconstructed the scene, they found that Brandon's car was not just misplaced. It was positioned in a way that subtly encouraged false confidence. From the driver's seat, the landscape offered few clues that something was wrong. The road continued forward. The ditch did not look severe. The horizon appeared open. Nothing about the environment clearly signaled danger. This is a critical detail, often misunderstood in retellings of the case. Brandon did not abandon his vehicle out of desperation. He believed leaving it was temporary. He believed he could reach help on foot and return with assistance. And under normal circumstances, that belief would not have been unreasonable. The car itself became the last fixed point in the investigation, the only physical location investigators could confirm with certainty. Everything after that moment relied on phone records, sound descriptions, and Brandon's own words. Police later confirmed that Brandon's vehicle showed no signs of foul play, no forced entry, no damage consistent with another car pushing it off the road, no mechanical failure that would explain erratic driving. The crash was simple. The damage was minimal. The consequences were not, because the danger that night did not come from the ditch. It came from what Brandon believed the ditch meant. He believed he was near town. He believed help was close. He believed walking was safer than waiting. Those assumptions were wrong, but he had no way of knowing that. And as Brandon stepped away from his car, carrying only his phone and his confidence, he left behind the one place investigators would later wish he had stayed. The ditch did not trap him. It misled him. The first call came shortly after Brandon stepped away from his car. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't rushed, and it didn't sound like an emergency. When Brandon Swanson dialed his parents, he spoke the way he always did, direct, calm, and practical. He told them his car was stuck in a ditch. He said he wasn't hurt. He believed he was near Lind and thought he could walk toward nearby lights while they came to find him. There was no hesitation in his voice. That detail has been emphasized repeatedly by investigators and family members alike. Brandon did not sound confused. He did not sound impaired. He did not sound frightened. He spoke clearly, answered questions directly, and seemed confident in his assessment of the situation. To his parents, this sounded manageable. On the other end of the line were Brandon Swanson and Annette Swanson. Like many parents in rural communities, they were familiar with late-night calls about stuck vehicles. Ditches were common. Tow trucks were slow. Sometimes it was easier to just go find your child and bring them home. They didn't hear danger. They heard inconvenience. Brandon explained that he was going to start walking. He believed the lights he saw were close. His parents asked him to stay put, but Brandon insisted he could reach a paved road quickly. He believed they were already heading toward him. That belief mattered. As the call continued, Brian and Annette got into their vehicle and began driving toward Lind, following the directions Brandon gave them. They asked questions. Brandon responded thoughtfully. He described what he could see and hear around him. His tone remained steady. He talked about fences. He mentioned water nearby. He commented on how dark it was. Nothing about his language suggested panic. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Brandon did not behave like someone who thought he was in danger. He behaved like someone who believed he was moments away from resolution. Meanwhile, his parents were trying to coordinate movement across an invisible gap. They told Brandon where they were driving. Brandon responded by adjusting his own direction, attempting to walk toward them. Neither side realized they were operating from entirely different assumptions about geography. As minutes passed, frustration crept in. Not fear, but confusion. Brian and Annette drove through Lind without seeing Brandon. They turned around. They drove slowly, scanning roadsides, calling out his name when they stopped the car. Brandon continued walking, describing landmarks that didn't align with what his parents were seeing. Still, no one panicked. At no point during the early part of the call did Brandon say he was lost. He did not say he felt unsafe. He did not ask them to call the police. He believed the situation was temporary, and his parents trusted that assessment. This mutual confidence delayed urgency. The call continued not because of fear, but because of coordination. Two parties trying to meet in the dark, relying on words alone to bridge physical distance. And that reliance on calm communication, so normal, so reasonable, became the most dangerous element of the night. Because, while Brandon was talking, while his parents were listening, time was moving forward. Battery life was draining, terrain was changing, and every step Brandon took away from his car carried him deeper into an area no one was searching yet. The phone call was meant to solve the problem. Instead, it quietly became the last thread connecting Brandon Swanson to anyone who knew where he was supposed to be. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon Swanson did not disappear. He moved, and his parents listened as it happened. From the moment Brandon Swanson began walking, the phone call became a fragile lifeline, one that captured fragments of his surroundings, but never revealed the full picture. Brandon described what he encountered as he moved through the darkness, narrating his environment in pieces. He talked about fences, wire fences that forced him to change direction. He mentioned the ground beneath his feet, uneven in places, soft in others. At one point, he told his parents he could hear water nearby. That detail stood out. Water suggested a bridge, a culvert, or a creek, features commonly found near roads. To Brandon, it reinforced the belief that he was close to a paved area, close to a recognizable landmark. To his parents, it sounded like progress. They told him where they were driving. He adjusted his direction to match. They slowed down, scanning the roadside. But the darkness was absolute. Rural Minnesota at night offers no ambient glow. Headlights illuminate only what's directly ahead. Everything else exists beyond reach, just outside visibility. Brandon's parents stopped repeatedly, rolled down their windows, and called his name into the empty air. They never heard him respond. At the same time, Brandon never said he could hear their car. This absence, sound not meeting sound, was not immediately alarming. Distance can swallow noise. Wind carries it away. Both sides assumed proximity would resolve the issue soon. Minutes passed. Brandon continued walking, guided by assumptions rather than markers. His voice remained steady, though fatigue began to creep in. He wasn't complaining, but his descriptions grew shorter, more focused on immediate obstacles rather than direction. His parents became increasingly confused. They drove past areas where Brandon believed he should be standing. They doubled back. They slowed to a crawl. At times, they were convinced they must be seconds away from seeing him. In reality, they were separated by miles. Investigators would later determine that while Brandon was walking north through fields and drainage areas, his parents were driving through Lind and nearby roads, parallel paths that never intersected. This was the most devastating misalignment of the night. The call did not fail because no one tried. It failed because everyone trusted the same incorrect assumption. At several points, Brandon told his parents he thought he could see them. He described lights moving. He believed they were close enough to meet if they just kept going. Those lights were not his parents' vehicle. They were farm equipment, yard lights, distant structures fixed in place, mistaken for motion in the dark. As the call stretched on, urgency finally began to surface, not as panic, but as confusion hardening into concern. Brandon's parents asked him to stay where he was. Brandon hesitated. He didn't want to stand still in the dark. He believed movement was better than waiting. Each decision felt reasonable in isolation. Together, they became irreversible. The missed connections happened quietly. At one point, Brandon crossed a road his parents had driven on earlier, minutes too late. At another moment, his parents passed within a short distance of where Brandon had been. But he had already moved on. The phone made it feel like they were close. Reality said otherwise. This is what makes those 47 minutes so difficult to comprehend. Help was not hours away. It was active, searching, communicating, and trying to adapt. And yet, the gap between Brandon and safety never closed. Then, without warning, the conversation changed. Brandon stopped describing his surroundings. His voice shifted, just slightly, and then he said two words. "Oh, shit." There was no explanation after that, no description, no follow-up. The line went silent, and for the first time that night, the phone no longer carried Brandon's voice forward. The words came without warning. There was no rising panic, no warning in his voice, no build-up that suggested fear. After nearly 47 minutes on the phone, Brandon Swanson abruptly said, "Oh, shit," and then the call ended. Those two words, spoken casually, instinctively, are the last confirmed record of Brandon Swanson's life. They were not shouted. They were not followed by a request for help. The phone did not disconnect immediately due to a dead battery. The line simply went silent. For investigators, that moment became the center of the case. Context matters here. Brandon had been walking steadily, describing fences, terrain, and water. He was not running. He was not breathless. He did not indicate that he had fallen or been injured before those final words. His tone, according to his parents, was consistent right up until the end. That sudden shift suggests a surprise, not a slow realization. Investigators believe Brandon encountered something unexpected, not something he anticipated, not something he had been navigating around for minutes, something immediate. The leading possibilities considered by law enforcement were environmental. The area Brandon was walking through contained drainage ditches, uneven ground, and the Yellow Medicine River and its tributaries. In darkness, water can be difficult to detect until a person is already too close. A steep bank, soft ground, or a sudden drop could cause someone to lose footing instantly. If Brandon fell into water or a ditch, it would explain the abruptness of his final words and the sudden silence that followed. However, investigators have never confirmed that such a fall occurred. No splash was heard on the call, no sound of impact, no continued noise. That absence is part of what makes the moment so difficult to interpret. Another factor investigators considered was terrain confusion. Brandon may have reached a physical barrier, a ravine, a culvert, or an obstacle that forced an immediate stop. In that scenario, the words, "oh shit," would reflect sudden recognition rather than injury. But again, there is no physical evidence to confirm this. What investigators have consistently emphasized is what they do not believe happened. There is no evidence of an altercation, no indication of another person being present, no signs of a struggle on the call. Brandon did not cry out. He did not ask for help. He did not mention seeing or hearing anyone else. That is critical, because it narrows the scope of possibilities to moments that could occur instantly, silently, and without warning. Events where a person would not have time to react beyond a reflexive phrase. From a behavioral standpoint, the phrase itself is revealing. "Oh shit" is often used when someone realizes a mistake or encounters an unexpected obstacle, not necessarily when they are already in pain or fear. It suggests realization rather than response. Investigators have noted that this moment likely marks a transition from movement to immobility, from navigation to crisis. After the call dropped, Brandon's parents tried immediately to reconnect. The phone rang but went unanswered. Calls continued throughout the night and into the following morning. There was no voicemail pickup, no text messages, no further communication. That silence is what elevated the situation from confusion to emergency. Law enforcement was contacted shortly afterward. In the entire case, there is no other moment where Brandon's condition changes so clearly and so suddenly. Everything before that point shows continuity, movement, communication, intent. Everything after is absence. That is why this moment is critical. It is the last fixed point in time, the last known sound of Brandon's voice. The final instance where his location, though misunderstood, was still actively narrowing. Every search grid, every theory, every investigative decision traces back to those two words, because whatever happened next happened fast, and it happened where no one could see it. Once the call ended and Brandon Swanson failed to answer repeated attempts to reconnect, the situation shifted rapidly from confusion to concern. By morning, law enforcement was notified. The initial police response focused on the last confirmed physical location, Brandon's car. Deputies from Yellow Medicine County Sheriff's Office located the vehicle later that day in a rural area north of where Brandon believed he was. The car was still sitting in the ditch, exactly where he had left it. There were no signs of tampering. The doors were closed. The keys were not in the ignition. Personal items were still inside. Most notably, there was no indication that Brandon had returned to the car after leaving it. That discovery set the framework for the search. Law enforcement established a perimeter around the vehicle and began a ground search outward, working under the assumption that Brandon had left the car on foot. The area was immediately recognized as challenging. Open farmland broken by drainage ditches, creeks, tall grass, and uneven ground. Visibility was limited. Footing was unstable. Landmarks were scarce. Within hours, volunteers began arriving. Friends, family members, local residents, and strangers joined organized search efforts. Search grids were established. Fields were walked line by line. Ditches were checked repeatedly. Bridges and culverts were inspected. Every accessible area within miles of the car was covered. Search dogs were brought in early. Canine units tracked scent from the car outward, following what investigators believed to be Brandon's initial walking path. The dogs led searchers toward nearby waterways and low-lying areas, places where scent could dissipate quickly or be carried away. Those trails ended without resolution. Helicopters were also deployed, scanning from above. Infrared imaging was used to detect heat signatures. Nothing was found. No movement, no body, no clothing. The terrain itself worked against the search. Tall crops limited visibility during daylight hours. Ditches and waterways were concealed by vegetation. Some areas were inaccessible without specialized equipment. Others were indistinguishable from one another, repeating mile after mile. Despite this, the search expanded. Over the following days, thousands of volunteer hours were logged. Law enforcement coordinated with neighboring counties. Areas were searched multiple times under different conditions, including after rainfall and during crop harvesting, when fields were cleared. Still, nothing surfaced. No footprints, no torn clothing, no phone, no wallet. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the search was what wasn't found. If Brandon had been injured, there was no blood. If he had fallen into water, no belongings surfaced downstream. If he had wandered until exhaustion, no trace marked where he stopped. The lack of physical evidence forced investigators to confront a difficult reality. The environment may have erased him. In rural landscapes like this, evidence doesn't always remain visible. Soft ground can recover quickly. Water can carry objects far from their origin. Wildlife can scatter remains. Time works relentlessly against recovery. Investigators did not conclude that Brandon had left the area by vehicle. There was no evidence of another car involved, no reports of suspicious activity, no sightings that suggested foul play. But absence does not equal explanation. As days turned into weeks, the search shifted from rescue to recovery. Law enforcement continued to monitor leads, but the physical search gradually slowed. The area around the car, once dense with people, returned to silence. For Brandon's family, the lack of answers was devastating. Searches are meant to narrow uncertainty. In this case, they widened it. Every method used, dogs, helicopters, volunteers, functioned as intended, and yet none of them produced the one thing that mattered, a definitive answer. The land had given nothing back. And without evidence to anchor the investigation, Brandon Swanson's disappearance moved from an active emergency into the category that offers the least comfort, an open, unsolved case. As the physical search yielded no answers, investigators were forced to rely on probability rather than proof. From the beginning, law enforcement made one position clear. There was no evidence to suggest criminal involvement in Brandon Swanson's disappearance. No witnesses reported suspicious behavior. No signs of another vehicle were found near his car. No physical indicators pointed to an altercation. Instead, investigators focused on environmental explanations. The most widely discussed theory centers on the landscape itself. The area surrounding Brandon's last known location is shaped by drainage systems, shallow ravines, and waterways connected to the Yellow Medicine River. These features are often concealed by tall grass and uneven terrain, especially at night. A person walking without visibility could step into a steep embankment or waterway without warning. Law enforcement has stated that if Brandon fell into water, several factors could explain why nothing was found. Water levels fluctuate. Currents can carry objects far from their entry point. Clothing and personal items may sink or become trapped under vegetation. Over time, remains can disperse beyond recognition, but this theory has limitations. Despite extensive searches downstream and repeated checks of waterways, no physical evidence was recovered. No phone, no shoes, no fragments of clothing. Nothing surfaced that could definitively place Brandon in the river or confirm a fall. Another explanation considered was exposure. Nighttime temperatures in rural Minnesota can drop significantly, even in late spring. Walking for an extended period through uneven terrain can lead to exhaustion, disorientation, and impaired judgment. In such conditions, a person may sit down or lie down to rest and never get back up. This possibility accounts for the lack of disturbance and the absence of struggle, but again it raises the same question. Why was no trace ever found? Investigators also examined whether Brandon may have become trapped in a concealed area, such as a culvert, drainage pipe, or dense vegetation. These spaces can be difficult to locate, even when searchers are nearby. Some may be hidden beneath grass or partially submerged. Yet repeated searches, including after crops were harvested and fields cleared, revealed nothing. Each theory explains part of the case. None explain all of it. There is also the question of timing. Brandon disappeared while help was actively searching for him. His parents were driving nearby. Law enforcement responded within hours. This was not a situation where days passed before anyone noticed something was wrong. That narrow window makes the complete absence of evidence especially difficult to reconcile. Law enforcement has consistently stated that there is no indication Brandon intentionally vanished. His personal history, financial records, and family relationships do not support voluntary disappearance. He left behind everything: his car, his belongings, his future plans. He did not plan to disappear. The official position remains cautious and unresolved. Investigators acknowledge that the environment could plausibly explain what happened, but they also acknowledge that the lack of evidence prevents a definitive conclusion. No theory has been proven. No explanation has closed the case. This uncertainty is what places Brandon Swanson's disappearance among the most unsettling unsolved cases, not because of what is known, but because of what isn't. A person can vanish without violence, without witnesses, without leaving a trace that survives the landscape. And when that happens, even the most thorough investigation reaches its limits. More than 15 years after the night Brandon Swanson vanished, his absence has not faded into memory for those who knew him. For his family, time has not brought clarity, only distance from the moment when everything changed. Brandon Swanson remains officially listed as a missing person. His case has never been closed. There has been no declaration of death, no recovery, and no definitive explanation offered by law enforcement. His parents have spoken publicly over the years with consistency and restraint. They have avoided speculation. They have not accused. Instead, they have focused on one central truth: Brandon did not choose to disappear. They describe him as responsible, dependable, and deeply connected to his family. They emphasize that if Brandon had been able to call again, he would have. If he had found help, he would have reached out. The silence that followed his final call is not interpreted as distance, it is understood as interruption. Law enforcement has echoed that position. The case remains open not because of new evidence, but because there is no evidence sufficient to close it. No remains have been found, no belongings recovered, no definitive cause determined. Without those elements, the investigation cannot move forward, and it cannot end. This unresolved status places Brandon's disappearance in a category that is particularly difficult for families and investigators alike. There is no final moment to process, no clear boundary between hope and grief. The question of what happened remains suspended. Over time, search methods improved. Fields were re-examined after harvests, waterways were revisited, new tips were evaluated. Still, nothing emerged that altered the core uncertainty of the case. And that uncertainty is the lesson Brandon's disappearance leaves behind. It reveals how fragile perception can be, how easily distance is misjudged in darkness, how familiar landscapes can become disorienting, and how quickly confidence can replace caution. It shows that time does not always widen the window for rescue. Sometimes it narrows it. Brandon was not lost for days before anyone noticed. He was not alone without contact. He was actively communicating with people who were searching for him, and still he vanished. The case underscores how rural environments operate on different rules than populated spaces, how sound doesn't travel, how light deceives, how a wrong assumption can compound quietly, step by step, until correction is no longer possible. Most of all, it demonstrates the limits of certainty, even with phone records, even with witnesses to his voice, even with immediate response. There are moments when answers do not arrive. Brandon Swanson's disappearance does not end with resolution. It ends with responsibility, the responsibility to acknowledge that some questions remain unanswered, not because of neglect, but because the truth left no trace behind. His name remains on record. His story remains unfinished, and his case remains open, not as a mystery to be sensationalized, but as a reminder that ordinary nights can change without warning, and that uncertainty, once introduced, does not obey timelines. Sometimes the line goes silent, and nothing fills the space that follows.